Hello and welcome to Partially Redacted. I'm your host, Sean Faulkner, and today I'm joined by Eric Dodds, Head of Product Marketing at RudderStack, and we'll be talking about data management, data pipelines, and data mistakes. Eric, welcome to the show.
Hey, Sean, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Let's start off with some basics. Who are you and what do you do?
Yeah, so my name is Eric Dodds, as you said, and I lead the product marketing team here at RudderStack. I started my career actually in the marketing space. I like to tell people that my two favorite subjects in school were consumer behavior and statistics. So I was probably going to do something related to data, and trying to use it to understand what people do and then how to get them to do stuff. And the more I got into that, I realized, well, if you have really good, clean data, it's accessible, you can make great decisions and do really cool stuff. But 90% of the battle is actually a technical battle getting to that point. So went deeper and deeper into the stack, did a number of things, built a number of stacks at different companies, did some consulting, found RudderStack and joined very early on. And today I lead the product marketing team.
Awesome. And, I was digging into some articles that you've written that are I would say, fairly technical in nature. Given RudderStack's, what they do in their audience, it makes a lot of sense. But I guess, how did you sort of bridge the gap of getting on sort of the more technical side of products coming from a sort of non-technical background?
Yeah, I mean, probably the way that a lot of people do. So you start out with a question that you want to answer and you just follow the technical threads to their logical conclusion. And so for me, that was trying to solve some pretty difficult problems around multi-touch attribution modeling. And there's software out there that, that sort of does that, but not super well. We've tried a lot of those solutions. We tried modeling it out ourselves in Excel, but we were running a very large business. And so at some point that doesn't work. So then you decide, okay, well, at this point we need to look at some sort of database solution. We need to start modeling this out in Python or SQL and, or maybe even, things like R if you want to get really fancy on the statistical side. And then you, of course, it's like, okay, well, you sort of load the data in there, but then you realize, well, if we had this other data, it would be even better, or we need this piece of the puzzle. So then you get into data pipelines. And so all of a sudden you're running sort of an analytics engineering type practice, and you're doing a bunch of data engineering with pipelines and all that sort of stuff. And so, and all of this is to answer some questions about, how many times does someone see an ad before purchasing, if that makes sense. So I'm sort of technical by nature. I like to, work on cars and just figure out how things work. And so I think it was just a natural flow for me to go deeper and deeper into the stack to just satisfy my own desire to figure out how to make it work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that journey makes a ton of sense because when you are, in a marketing organization, your tip of the spear, there's a lot of data that's coming in, and a lot of the challenge around that, marketing is responsible for is figuring out, how do we make this more efficient? How do we, find more, customers that look like our customers and all these types of things? And naturally, that's going to lead you down a path of analytics when you reach a certain scale. And I actually think that's a great sort of segue and kicking off point because I want to talk about data management. And one of the first things I wanted to kind of pick your brains on was, if I'm an organization that's just getting started, at what point does it make sense for me to move beyond spreadsheets and maybe querying a database directly or something like that to a more sophisticated data stack where I am building a warehouse and I'm using modern tooling?
Man, that's a great question. And it's hard to answer depending on the business. I work for a data company, software as a service. And so it may sound counterintuitive for me to say this, but in many ways you can ride the spreadsheet horse for a very long time and allow a lot of people who don't necessarily know how to work directly with a database to do a lot of really cool things. And so I think it's easy to just dismiss Excel as, it's just Excel. You need to get a data warehouse. But in fact, if your business isn't super complicated and if you don't have if your data is fairly well structured, you can do a ton with Excel. But there's a limit to that in terms of the level of complexity and the questions that you can answer. And it also depends on the type of business, right? If you're a software business, then you're actually generating a lot of data from the software that you're providing. So users using it, transactions happening within the software itself. And there's probably some sort of database that's driving that from the back end. If you're a services business, you can probably go a lot longer without necessarily having to adopt infrastructure like a data warehouse, just because you're not generating as many types of data from a software application. So it kind of depends on the business, but one of the key sort of milestones that I would say where you need to start thinking about this is when you begin to have a need for event-based data that represents user behavior. And that may sound like a very, very specific sort of tipping point, but there's a big reason why I say that's the point to start thinking about it. Because if you think about the software that runs a normal business, you have a CRM, you may have a marketing tool, you may have accounting software, you may have an ERP or something like that. And all of these are essentially just managed databases that host structured data, right? And so you can actually combine a lot of data and do some interesting analysis with VLOOKUPs in Excel, which is why I said, if that's all you have, you don't have to get a database to get value out of data. But when you move to time series data, where you have a number of events that represent some sort of action and they have a timestamp, and especially when those events need to be associated with distinct entities like a user or an account, that type of data is not, you really can't analyze that at scale or even a small scale in Excel. It becomes very, very difficult. It's structured very differently. You're not just sort of looking up like a Salesforce account ID with a, SAP account ID or whatever, to sort of get the same information. You're actually dealing with a series of events performed by an individual. Now, why is that important? Well, when you think about things like attribution or, from a marketing perspective, feature adoption, from a product perspective, when you think about things like customer churn from a customer success perspective, all of those require you to understand what events happened in what order and who performed them. And so that's a point at which you need infrastructure to help you manage that, because time series data is pretty tough. And so that's sort of maybe just one of the things that I would start to think about in terms of, when do I need to start looking at infrastructure? There are probably a ton of other, edge cases and different business types, but
yeah, I think that it is like, it really resonates with me. I do think also like that we can become like, people get too in love sometimes with like the modern data stack where a series of spreadsheets will get the job done. It might not require a super sophisticated tech stack. And there's an advantage there in terms of probably everyone in your company has the talent to be able to put together a spreadsheet or navigate a spreadsheet and maybe not run complex, SQL statements and generate BI reports and stuff like that. But organizationally, the spreadsheets can get pretty unwieldy if you're trying to do a lot with those, because then you got to come up with some sort of process of like, how do we control keep track of like changes in these and different versions and all this sort of stuff, and it starts to get a little bit crazy. So I think that is also another trigger where it might make sense for someone to move to a more medium stack. And on the event thing, it's true. Like if your HubSpot, your Salesforce or CRM, they'll track things at an event level or time series level, but they don't really do a great job in providing like tooling for the analysis of those, especially if you're trying to aggregate this stuff from multiple places. So at some point, you're going to need something that's like specifically designed for that. And let's say that, I get to that point. it makes sense for me to, modernize, move beyond spreadsheets. Like, where do I start in that process? Like, what tools should I be considering? Like, how do I even get started?
Just want to reaffirm your point about sort of we would say, maybe software engineering best practices are difficult to apply to spreadsheet workflows.
Yes.
So just wanted to reaffirm that. That's definitely another sign that you may need to move to more modern tooling. For sure. Also, one other side note on that, there are a number of new tools. Superblocks is one that we use, but they're actually tools for building internal tools. That sounds kind of funny, but they also include sort of deep spreadsheet-like functionality, but give you, maybe Postgres under the hood or the ability to write some SQL. So there's also sort of this interesting new world where you can basically put infrastructure behind spreadsheets. But okay, where do you start? Well, the first thing I would say is I would think about what your needs are going to be as a business. 1, 3, sort of maybe 5 is a long period of time, but maybe between 1 and 3 years down the road. And that's going to help you think through, what do I actually need to implement here? And what problem am I trying to solve? Because one of the big challenges with adopting technology is that your initial need is not going to be the same need that you have, a year down the road. And so you run into these situations where, well, we're going to adopt some sort of technology to satisfy this immediate need that we have. And then in 6 months, 12 months, you say, well, now this need has grown a lot. And it turns out that the initial technology that we adopted isn't sufficient to meet that need anymore. And so now we have to go not only sort of redo or undo work that we did before, but shop for a new solution and deal with all the contracts and everything associated with that. And so I think really assessing what you're trying to do is a huge part of it, because that's going to dictate the decisions that you make. And that's a really tricky line to walk, right? Because sometimes it can feel like you're over provisioning early, but those things can become really, really valuable later on. So that's the first thing I would say. Second, I would say I would think about the concept of abstraction and sort of integrate the two concepts that I would put at the forefront. So one is abstraction and 2 is integration. And I'll explain what each of those mean, but I would sort of uphold those as like values in the way that you think about constructing your stack. So one is abstraction. What do we mean by that? Well, let's just take the example of, let's say product usage data for a product team that wants to understand feature adoption or better understand user flows, or they're rolling out a new, product as part of their platform and they want to understand that. Well, you're going to need behavioral data, which is time series event data. And a lot of times the first tool that you're going to reach for is some sort of product analytics tool, right? At this point, you're probably far beyond a Google Analytics because that's mainly more used for marketing use cases. And so let's say that you implement a product analytics tool, like a Mixpanel or something similar. And okay, that's great. You instrument some events with their SDK and you get to see feature adoption and you uncover some insights and all that's awesome. Okay, then 6 months down the road, your feature's doing great. You've made modifications. It's getting a really high level of adoption. And then the sales team comes knocking on the door and says, hey, we've noticed that there's like tons of usage among this, like certain customers. What are they doing, And all of a sudden, you now have data bringing 2 teams together and creating additional questions, right? Who are these customers? What are they doing? How large are they? How much are they spending with us, right? And now what happens at that point? Well, the challenge is that the account level information is not in Mixpanel. It's just collecting behavioral events. It may have some high level information about here's the username and here's their business name or whatever. But now you're at a point where you actually have to try to manually combine data in a spreadsheet again to get some of those answers to the sales team, right? So this is a good example of how if you just reach for a tool and implement it to solve a near-term problem, you may actually create technical debt in the future. So generally, I would say, when we think about abstraction, it's, are you implementing this in a way that will allow you to get to implement additional workflows in the future? That's abstraction. And so one of the ways to think about that, and sort of, I'll give a couple examples here. One of the challenges is that with just implementing a Mixpanel or an Amplitude or something with their own SDK, is that you can't, it's hard to get the data to other places. I mean, you can export it out of there, but it's really just sort of a one-to-one, like you're tracking an event into an analytics tool and building a report. And so you can abstract that event collection out. And so you can use an SDK from a company like RudderStack, shameless plug, that will actually abstract that event layer out and capture that event as its own agnostic JSON, basically a JSON blob that represents an event. And then you can send that to Mixpanel, but you can also send it to other downstream destinations like a data warehouse or another analytics tool or a marketing tool, et cetera. And so that gives you a ton of option value for the future, is actually abstracting away sort of the direct instrumentation of those sorts of things. And I would say also, like, you can think about that two ways, like choosing a data collection tool that is an abstraction layer, but then also choosing downstream tools, analytics providers, marketing tools that actually like accept that abstraction layer is really important. And then integration is the other one, which is sort of directly related and really logically follows. But if we're sending a copy of the event to Mixpanel, we should also send a copy of that event to a data warehouse. And this is an area that I think is probably one of the, I think it's becoming easier, but when you're early in an organization, that feels like a really big step. But every company that I've been at where we've made that decision really early, 6 months later, we thank ourselves, because it's like, we want to run some more complex analysis that we can't do in our analytics tools, and someone needs to write SQL. Well, the challenge is, where's all that historical data that we were sending directly to Mixpanel, right? And then, of course, the logical flow from that is, if you have all the event data in there, you can also pull in your Salesforce data, your ERP data, like whatever you want. And that's your foundation for sort of building a more, modern analytics practice. So that was a really long answer to the question, but abstraction and integration.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's similar to like if you're a software engineer and you're implementing something, like you can take sort of the shortest path to getting something working, but it's probably not going to be super flexible. And then you can go the extreme other end where you spend a lot of time, sort of over engineering it, and maybe it's super flexible, but it took forever to get there and it's complicated for you to maintain. So you have to find sort of that right balance between solving your needs today while also being able to solve sort of your needs for tomorrow.
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
So besides like figuring out that right balance, like what are some of the other problems that people might run into as they start on this journey of sort of, modernizing their data stack?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a couple. So one of them actually, and this may sound a little bit funny, is that one thing that I do like about putting sort of money and decision-making behind investing in data infrastructure is that it creates an opportunity, and I use that word, very carefully. It creates an opportunity for the business to talk about their data that, they may not create for themselves otherwise. And the reason I think that's important is, we can throw a ton of technology at these data problems, but the real value that comes from data is actually the shared understanding of different teams across the organization around what makes data valuable for the company and the questions that you want to answer, right? And a classic example of this is, let's say a company spends tons of money, like, sort of implementing, some of this modern data tooling. They have multiple analytics tools, but they have an abstracted data layer. Maybe they're using an abstracted transformations layer in the warehouse like dbt. And so they really have sort of the best of these tools available to them that create this environment where you can be really efficient. But the company still has, multiple definitions of what an active user is, right? Well, at that point, what's the return on investment for all of these awesome tools that you're using, right? It's pretty low, actually, in my opinion, because they're just making it easier for you to, they're making it easier and faster for people to create different versions of the truth. And so that, I would say, all of the technology aside, and I mean, there are certainly other things that you can run into from a technological perspective, and happy to chat about those. But that, I would say, is probably the biggest thing that I would encourage people to really think about, is that, yes, at some point, you're going to need some of these modern tools to make your company more efficient so that you can do a lot more with your data without spending as many resources. But if you don't align the organization around what you're trying to do with data and the definitions specifically of what the data means, then you're going to actually spend a lot of money. And we are seeing increasingly, of course, in this economic environment, where a lot of finance departments are saying, I need you to explain to me why we're paying this amount of money for this set of tools that we're using for data. And I need you to help, like, here's a pen, like draw the line from me from all of these tools and this cost to like our revenue, And so those are really important conversations to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the basically like agreeing on the definition of things is probably a step that a lot of people like overlook, because you assume essentially everyone's using the same terminology and maybe has the same understanding. Like even at my company, Skyflow, we went through recent exercise with the go-to-market teams to sort of make sure that we were all aligned on like what's the definition of an opportunity and what is the definition of each of our stages of our sales cycles and stuff like that. Because over time, those things can kind of drift as you have new employees come in and stuff like that. And then they might be using a tool or creating a new report or something like that that is interpreting the data in a different way. And that just leads to sharing of misleading data. And then always a conversation of like, where did you get this? Like, is everyone talking the same thing and stuff like that? And it's not even a tool problem. It's really just like a people problem of like, hey, let's agree on what we're talking about up front.
Or business processes change. I mean, that's a huge one. And I think that's one of those things where it's not like anyone's doing anything wrong or bad, or, it's just that, okay, well, we launched a new product or we brought on a new team to change part of our go-to-market motion, right? And so it's like, well, in that case, like the definition of an opportunity is literally different in this context than it was before. And that's totally a people problem, right? But it can get really sideways in the data because people are trying to make decisions on this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And hiring decisions, justification for costs are all made based on those things.
100%. Yeah.
So besides that, are there, as people start to do this, like, are there sort of, common mistakes that people make, even from like a technical standpoint of like, they start implementing something and then they regret 6 months later about something that they did up front?
Man, that's a great question. So many. I'm trying to think of the top ones that I would want to bring up. One I would say actually is, and this is just an extension of what I said previously, but actually has like a technical, is sort of the practical day-to-day technical manifestation of alignment. But having some sort of shared catalog of data definitions is really important. Now we just talked about that from a business perspective, right? Like, let's align on the definition of an opportunity or an active user. And those things are really, really important. But then there's this entire, let's say, supply chain. Some people don't love that analogy, but for the sake of brevity, this supply chain of people who are involved in the, raw data coming in, and then that business metric coming to fruition in, let's say, some sort of BI dashboard, right? There are a lot of things and people involved in that process. So if we go to the very, very beginning of this process, you're collecting an event probably as a website visit or an app sign up or something of that nature, where a user encounters your brand or your product for the very first time. Well, you're capturing that event, and then you have this entire flow of things that happen, along the way for that user, their account information. Again, all sorts of business models, right? It could be a purchase, it could be anything, as an opportunity in Salesforce that materializes in some sort of BI dashboard. And so, what a shared data catalog helps enable is people who are have a greater distance from the sort of practical reality of the business definition. It gives them guidelines. And so a great example of that is the software engineer on the mobile app or the website who's instrumenting some sort of data capture, right? I mean, of course, like, they want the business to be successful, and that's why they're there working hard every day and writing code. But it may not be their passion in life to understand what the definition of an S2 opportunity is, right? And how the definition of an active user plays into that, and all these different things, right? They're trying to make a stable, usable, accessible mobile app. And so, well, how do we actually help enable that person to make informed decisions when they are capturing really critical data in the software that they're building? That's super important. Data quality is another really big piece of the puzzle. This is something we focus on a ton at RudderStack. And so actually just earlier this year, we released a huge data quality suite. So governance tools that allow you to sort of flag any violations against your definitions right at the source so that you don't have problems downstream. So that's probably, again, I mean, this is just an extension from alignment, but there's a lot of really great tooling all across the stack that allows you to sort of take that alignment and actually implement it from a technical standpoint with guardrails, guidelines, et cetera, for people who are much more distant from sort of the building of that definition, or it doesn't necessarily impact their day-to-day work, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So walk me through that. Like, how do I go about creating sort of a more of like a technically defined definition of what, let's say, like what an active user is, and then make it so that I am putting these kind of guardrails in place so that when someone's capturing data, they're building something, it's building against the correct definition?
Oh man, that's a great question. There's been a lot of, I guess you would say, traditionally you'd say ink spilled, but I would probably say VC bank accounts spilled to try to answer this question, because there are tons of data cataloging tools. There's tons of approaches to this. But I think that I'll just give you a very brief overview. So one, I would say, if you start looking around for tools, it's overwhelming. Because data cataloging, data lineage, I mean, you can go down this rabbit hole, and there are, hundreds of tools literally to try to solve this problem. I would start simple. Like, if you're not doing this, like a shared document or a shared spreadsheet, you should start there before you buy any software or think about buying any software, right? Because the whole thing is, if you can't get people aligned internally, then there's no way that software is going to help. Right? It's like you said, it's a people problem. So I would start there, and then the point at which that becomes untenable or causes problems because of software engineering best practices, then maybe start looking for some tools. There are a couple different areas, and I would think about those areas kind of as different points in the supply chain. So some of that can happen in the pipeline. And so you have ETL tools like a Fivetran, you have event streaming tools like a RudderStack that are capturing data and they're moving it from a source to a destination. That's certainly an area where, if you're evaluating a vendor and that, to move data from point A to point B, I would I would push really hard on understanding what their capabilities are around being able to enforce sort of some level of governance on the data as it's being moved from point A to point B. Because if you can do it, if you the farther up you can do it, the less work it is, because someone's going to have to model that in the warehouse. Now, that's usually just related to the inputs that are going to be eventually transformed in the data warehouse using SQL or some other modeling tool. But if you can handle it at the pipeline as much as you can do there, that's awesome, because it just means less work downstream, less human time, less code, less compute cost in your warehouse. Once the data gets into the warehouse, and this also applies to SaaS tools, right? If you're just sending data directly to a SaaS tool, I mean, if it's bad data, someone has to do cleanup there, which is even harder, right? I mean, deleting data, cleaning it up, all that sort of stuff. Once the data gets into the warehouse, there's this concept of a semantic layer where you can actually build some of the definitions into code that serves as the underlying foundation for reports, right? And so you can actually create definitions around what an active user is, and that sort of is a let's say a canonical definition for the company. And so it will actually aggregate all the information related to that. And it generally, the way this works is it sort of materializes as a table that is available for other people to use in reports or other types of things that they're trying to do with the data. So that everyone says, okay, this is the active users table, right? And I can clearly see the definition and I can clearly see the code. And there are probably only a few people who can actually edit that so that we're not creating different definitions. And those sort of span the spectrum. I mean, dbt has a really robust semantic layer. There's sort of a general purpose. You can build any sort of semantic definition that you want. What is an order, or what is an account, et cetera. RudderStack actually has semantic layer tooling specifically built for customer data around a customer 360, right? So building a golden customer record, if you will. And we are interoperable with dbt for a lot of that stuff. And, there are a number of other tools out there. But that's really the other layer that I would say. And there are data cataloging tools and other things like that. A lot of those are actually built into tools like a dbt or a RudderStack. So, you just sort of be wise as you choose those. But I would say governance on collection, and then some sort of semantic layer and catalog to help you make those definitions. Ultimately, set those definitions as concrete code that only a few people can change, but that are accessible to the entire company to use.
Okay. And then, we've touched on a couple times, RudderStack, but, I think it would be helpful, like to deep dive a little bit there. Like, where does RudderStack sit in sort of this lifeline of data flowing from sort of probably the application transactional layer down into something like a warehouse?
Yep. So, this is actually kind of explaining the narrative arc of where we've been as a company. So initially we were an event streaming pipeline, and we're still one of the top vendors in the market for streaming behavioral events from an app or a website or really any sort of source as raw first party data into downstream destinations, including the warehouse or the data lake. And over the last 2 years, we've really focused on providing value around combining that event data with all of the other data that's in the warehouse, right? So we specialize in event-based, sort of time series user behavioral data, but there's a ton of other customer data in the warehouse. And it's worth pointing out, we really only work with customer data, right? So anything sort of related to a customer user account, et cetera, inventory data, other things like that. I mean, we don't really handle that, financial reporting, we don't do. So anything related to customer data. And so we really built a core competency in event streaming, which is one of the hardest things to do. We do it really well, but there's a ton of other customer data that companies have in their warehouse. And so we started to work with them to understand, what are you trying to do with this event data, or what types of data are you combining it with? What problems are you solving? And so one of the first problems that they tried to solve was identity resolution, right? So I have all this event stream data from all these different users, and I need to build a clear understanding of how that event data relates to the data from my CRM, the data from my, transactions, right? From purchases, right? So that I can associate a purchase with a user. And all of this is in service of understanding questions like, what's the lifetime value of a user, et cetera. Well, we heard over and over from our customers that we were trying to answer these questions, build analytics, these SQL queries got super gnarly. And we realized at the end, what we're really doing is sort of backing into building some sort of identity graph, right? We just didn't really know we were doing that, but now we have 10,000 lines of, nested SQL that only a couple people know how to touch without breaking it. We dove really deeply into that problem. And so, in addition to providing the event ingestion pipeline that goes into the warehouse, we now have a data modeling tool called Profiles. And it makes it very, very easy for data teams to generate an identity graph and then run computations over that identity graph. And it really was sort of birthed out of this need for us to help our customers combine event data with structured data in order to get a clear understanding of who their customer was in their warehouse, right? And which is a very hard problem, especially with event data, but that is an area of expertise for us. And so it's a data modeling layer. It allows you to write very basic definitions, and then it generates all the SQL required to transverse all these tables, build an identity graph. And then an example we like to use is, let's say let's say you're a company that has multiple websites, multiple apps, maybe you have in-store visits, and the marketing team wants to know, when is the last time that our company interacted with a user, right? It sounds like a very simple question, but think about all the types of data you have to aggregate. You have to aggregate event data from a website, event data from a mobile app, probably multiple websites and mobile apps, right? Which are different data sources. You need to pull your point of sale data in so that you can see transactions from a particular customer. Then you have to figure out, how do I connect my mobile app user to the website user to the in-store user? And that's a very, very challenging problem. And so what Profiles does is it makes it very easy to build the identity graph. And then if the identity graph includes data from all of those different sources, it's very easy to compute a metric like last seen, where you can just look for the most recent timestamp across any of these data sources. And so these are projects that our customers were telling us took, months or even years sometimes. And so we built a tool that sort of helps them do that. And then the last piece of that would be, we do also have a pipeline that allows you to push that into, say, like a marketing or sales tool to sort of get those computed user features into a business tool so that you can create a segment for email campaigns or, get it into Salesforce for the sales team.
Is that's essentially like a reverse ETL process?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, once you have sort of this like identity graph and you know who a person is and the activities associated with that person across all these sort of disparate tools, then there's a bunch that unlocks a bunch of different use cases essentially that before would exist as sort of a data silo within a specific tool. And you'd have to go and like look in all these different places, right?
Yep. Yeah. Absolutely.
How do you sort of think through some of the challenges around like privacy and security when you're handling? Obviously, this is like highly sensitive data. This is your customer's customer data. So how does that kind of stuff work?
Oh man, that's a great question, and my team is going to really give it to me for not bringing this up earlier in my description of RudderStack. But One of the reasons that I joined RudderStack was because we actually don't store or persist any data as a company, which was really a big deal to me because in previous days that was a really big challenge, just dealing with security issues and managing a data stack and having to explain to InfoSec, okay, well, here's all the companies that we're using, that the vendors that are storing our data. RudderStack's a really unique company, and so even with the pipeline that's ingesting events, we don't persist any of that data. So it is ingested to our system temporarily, and then it's delivered to your destination. So it may be delivered to an analytics tool like we talked about, or a data warehouse or a data lake. But then once it's successfully delivered, we delete it from our system. And so it only stays there for a temporary time until it's delivered, which generally is an extremely brief period of time. And so from a security and compliance standpoint, that's a really huge thing for our customers, because they don't have to worry about us having a data breach or us storing a copy of their data. Even from a cost standpoint, it's much more efficient because we're not storing, trillions and trillions of our customers' data points on our own servers.
Yeah.
So that's a really huge deal. And then the Profiles product actually just runs all natively within the customer's warehouse. That's why we call ourselves a warehouse native customer data platform. So all of the stuff I talked about in terms of building, sort of the golden customer record, or the identity graph, all of that is transparent code that runs directly within the customer's warehouse. And so we don't store any of that data. And so we've done, we have some really great case studies with companies in highly regulated industries because, we don't store any of the data, which is really huge for them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're either acting essentially under like sort of GDPR terms, a data processor versus a controller. And then for the things that like the identity graph, basically that compute is actually running fully within the customer's environment.
Yep. And all the code runs there and it's portable. And so like you own it, right? And so you write definitions, the code is generated and runs as a job in your warehouse. And so you can go, we have customers all the time who go audit the SQL that we generate because it's theirs. It lives in their warehouse.
Right. How do you like manage updates to something like that? How do you push updates?
That's a great question. So it's most of our customers use a command line interface. And so the product at the core is a Python library that you run, and you have a set of YAML configuration files where you write your definitions, define the inputs and the column names for the unique identifiers for the identity graph. And you run the jobs via command line interface. Some of that, the output is actually accessible for business users within the RudderStack interface. But just like any other command line tool, it's versioned. And so when we roll out new versions, you are not forced to do that, but you can upgrade the version. And so, it's all done via command line.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then for some of the pipeline stuff so I know that you have like an open source offering. Is there also essentially like a SaaS version or a service version of this where you basically pipelines is hosted on your infrastructure and
Yes.
Essentially data is just passing through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the core of our event stream product is open source. There are actually some extremely large corporations using it. It's Kubernetes native. But of course, like any other SaaS business, it doesn't come with some of the bells and whistles, like the data governance stuff that we talked about. That's really nice on the governance side. But one of our core values as a company is transparency. And so, all of the code for the integrations that we send data to, all that transformer code is available. You could, again, run the product yourself on Kubernetes. But some of the really quality of life features and some of the things that our enterprise customers require are part of our paid cloud offering. In terms of cost efficiency, because we believe that the customer's warehouse should be at the center of their data stack. There are a lot of cost advantages to running an architecture that's warehouse native, even if it's not open source. and then Profiles is not open source either, but in accordance with our value of transparency, all of the code that it generates is completely transparent in your warehouse, and you can see all the jobs. And so even though that's not technically an open source product, it aligns with our value of transparency.
Awesome. Well, Eric, as we start to wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share?
We just did a big launch, two features actually that are pretty interesting. We've gotten pretty technical, as you can tell. I love digging into the technical side, but one of the things we've been working on a lot is actually helping support the alignment question that we talked about. And so how do we, from our view, the big question is, how do we get business users closer to the data that the data team is producing? Reverse ETL seems like a really easy answer. Like, we're just going to throw it over the fence to you with this pipeline. But that's not actually reflective of the value that a lot of companies are looking for in giving their business users a deeper understanding of the data itself, right? It's not just tell me what fields you want to sync this to in your marketing tool. And so we launched two new features. One is called Cohorts, one is called Activations. Cohorts allows data teams to define business definitions like active users for the entire company, and actually expose that entire data set through a UI to a business user. And then Activations, you could think of it as reverse ETL for a business user. So they can just go in, filter down that cohort, and then sync only the data they need to their tool. So we're super excited about those two products. You can go onto our blog and see the announcement. But yeah, that's the only thing I would say. We're pretty pumped about it. Our customers are giving us great feedback.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that sounds super valuable, kind of going back to some of the pain points that we were talking about. And I've definitely felt those pain points in for every organization I've worked for, including the ones that I started myself. So,
yeah.
So it seems like it'd be very, very valuable. But Eric, thanks so much for joining us. This was great.
Sean, thanks for having me. Had a great time.
Cheers.